Hello, greetings everyone. This is the weekly live video for Q&A office hours. Of course, most people see the recording rather than attend live, so maybe I shouldn't call it a live video, but it's recorded live. Hope you're all doing well and staying centered. I'll just start with a poem, a short poem that is one of my favorites, and some of you have probably heard this multiple times from me. But it really is one of the best single poems about the spiritual life. So this is called Paradox by Jed McKenna. You will never achieve spiritual enlightenment. The you that you think of as you is not you. The you that thinks of you as you is not you. There is no you, so who wishes to become enlightened? Awakening is your destiny, more certain than sunrise. You cannot fail to achieve awakening. Were you told otherwise? Irresistible forces compel you. The universe insists. It's not within your power to fail. There is no path to awakening. It lies in all directions, at all times. On the journey to awakening, you create and destroy your own path with every step. No one can follow another's path. No one can step off the path. No one can lead another. No one can turn back. No one can stop. Awakening is closer than your skin, more immediate than your next breath, and forever beyond your grasp. It need not be sought because it cannot be found. It cannot be found because it never was lost. It cannot be lost because it is not other than that which seeks. The paradox is that there is no paradox. Now, isn't that the damnedest thing? So yeah, it's a little bit it's a little bit abstruse, perhaps, the first time you hear it. Is the video okay? Is it doing this weird jumping thing for you guys, or is that just what I'm seeing? I think it's okay. Okay, questions. We have some interesting questions. I'll just get right to them. Somebody says, I would like to ask how the planning with the retreat center in Portugal is going and how one can participate on retreats and teachings in the near future. Okay, so the retreat center in Portugal is currently under construction. We've been doing some renovations there, adding dorm rooms, a bungalow, and we're gonna build a yoga shala soon, and that's exciting. And yeah, it's various projects are underway there. So we hope to open it, to have the grand opening in August. You know, we need to see how things go, obviously, but it's looking good for August, I think. And we'll announce that when we're relatively sure that it's going to happen. And in the meantime, we've been creating all these different offerings for you guys, such as in 15 days, we have the online Mahavidyā retreat. And this is the replacement for what was going to be the first retreat at the Portugal Retreat Center in May. So we're having it online. It's a 5-day retreat. And it really is a retreat. This is not a course. This is not a workshop. So you need to set aside 5 days totally where you're doing nothing else. You're on retreat. So this is not something you do while you're also working and doing other projects. This is a retreat. And it's very, very powerful to set 5 days aside for sadhana, for spiritual practice and learning and study and contemplation and more practice. So I can't recommend that strongly enough. For many people, these are uncertain times or challenging times or strange times. This is just how people write letters these days. I notice if anyone writes, they're like, hope you're doing well in these strange and uncertain times. It's just like a catchphrase that these days. I don't personally find them any stranger than or more uncertain than any other times, but more about that later. More importantly, that for many people, this is a challenging moment this spring in life, and there's really nothing better than retreat, than taking these 5 days and going deep. You'll find that it's incredibly rewarding, that you become much more centered and grounded. I won't go on about it, but it's phenomenal. So there's a post about that in the group. Just seeing the live comments. Okay. Somebody else asks, from which Tantra texts come the knowledge of the 10 Mahavidyas? Well, actually, multiple sources. There's quite a few sources. Now, this particular list of 10 goddesses, called the 10 Mahavidyas, usually wrongly translated as the 10 great wisdom goddesses. But here, in fact, the word vidya actually means mantra. Vidya is a feminine word for mantra, peculiar to the tantric tradition. You do not find the word vidya used this way outside the tantric tradition. So originally these goddesses were so-called Mahavidyas to refer to the fact that they were associated with esoteric tantric mantras. Not just associated, the mantras express and embody the energy of the deity. And more recently, the term is translated wisdom goddesses, but and of course they do embody wisdom. That just wasn't the original meaning of their name. Anyway, this particular list of the 10 is relatively late. It's part of the post-classical period of Tantra, and that's 13th to 17th centuries. And the sadhanas of these deities are taught in multiple sources. Texts like Tantrasara, not Abhinavagupta's Tantrasara, another later Tantrasara, Mantra Mahodadi, and some other sources as well. And they're also strongly part of the oral tradition. So a lot of teaching on the Mahavidyas is passed down through the oral tradition. That really fills out what's found in the texts. And that's, one reason we have Dr. Kavita Chinayan teaching this retreat, because she has access to and has received oral teachings on the Mahavidyas that I haven't received. I'm very fortunate to have had many great teachers, but not in the Mahavidyas in particular, though I have received transmissions of several of them, but not all of them. Anyway, just a brief answer to that for now, as we get into some of the more specifically spiritual questions here. So Jennifer asks about forgiveness, and she says, I don't know how to forgive, and you know, asks about it in general, and says, yeah, well, she says a number of things, but I'll just cut to the chase about forgiveness. Forgiveness never means that you are saying what that person did was okay after all. I thought it was horrible, and now I've decided it's okay. That's not what forgiveness is. You don't need to decide that anyone's behavior was okay in order to forgive them. It's a separate issue. A kind of, you know, moral or philosophical evaluation of their behavior is simply a separate issue from the one of forgiveness. So forgiveness is the antidote to when you are holding on to something in yourself that's hurting you. So we practice forgiveness for our own benefit, not for the other person. And whether you express that forgiveness verbally or in written form to the person you're forgiving is not that important, and indeed is not recommended in some cases. You know, if the person has some of the traits of narcissism or you know, psychopathy, then you don't actually want to express the forgiveness to them, because such a person will always seek to use that against you at some future point. You know, it depends on the person, it depends on the relationship. Sometimes expressing forgiveness can be a bridge to healing and reconnection with somebody, and sometimes it can't. So that's very much a case-by-case basis. But the much more important issue is finding the forgiveness in your own heart. Now, what does it actually mean? Well, first of all, you contemplate that this person couldn't have acted differently from how they did at that time, right? That doesn't give them any pass or excuse, you know, especially for now. But, you know, whatever happened in the past, every person's actions is, you know, we can say in general, people's actions are a product of their conditioning, their own unresolved pain, their own misunderstandings. And it's absolutely true to say that they couldn't have done differently from how they did, given what they were dealing with. You know, again, that doesn't mean it was okay. It doesn't mean that there's approval for these damaging or hurtful actions. But it is also important to understand that no one knowingly does bad. You know, as Socrates argued, you know, 2,400 years ago or more, nobody knowingly does bad. Everybody has a story about why their actions were actually okay, even if they're completely wrong. I'm just trying to illustrate the point that everybody has a story that justifies their actions to themselves, or that minimizes the harm or pain that others might be expressing in relation to those actions. You know, sometimes people say, oh, well, yeah, okay, maybe I didn't do the right thing there, but it's not that big of a deal, isn't it? You're blowing it out of proportion, right? So they'll dismiss your pain, or minimize it, or tell a story that to themselves at least, that explains it away or justifies it. And of course, the vast majority of this is simply delusion, you know, but we're all deluding ourselves at least part of the time, if not more, because we're always narrativizing our actions in a way that that justifies them. That's just what, human brains do. And it does take quite a bit of work to stop doing that. So then, in the case of people who just do obviously harmful things, because we can sort of divide these harmful actions into these two camps where, it's inadvertent harm or unintentional harm. And of course, if you've reached any level of maturity, you don't surround yourself with people who do intentional harm. But even when people are doing intentional harm, it's important to understand that that is an expression of how damaged they are, because it can be the case that when somebody is in so much pain, whether they experience it as what they would call pain or not, they're so disconnected or disassociated or in so much pain that they can't do anything but whatever harmful action it was that they did. And people are always seeking connection. And sometimes when people are badly hurt, they seek connection by hurting others, because then the other people, they believe, and this is usually a subconscious belief, but the other people are now in the same boat with them, right? If they hurt someone else, then that person knows what it's like to be them a little bit more. So that's their distorted form of connection. And again, usually they're not sort of thinking this through logically or anything. It's just an instinctive drive for connection that in somebody who's very, very damaged or hurt themselves, and usually in their early childhood, that's how it expresses. The instinctive drive for connection is, I want you to hurt like I'm hurting, and then what it's like to be me. Again, this doesn't make it, in any way okay. It's just that forgiveness for most people is enabled by some degree of understanding. And the understanding, can take these different forms, like realizing the person couldn't have done differently from how they did at that time, realizing that whether it's visible to you or not, that person's in a lot of pain, and couldn't do anything but lash out. Understanding that they as horrible as whatever they did seems to you, they absolutely have stories that conceal the harmfulness of their actions to themselves, right? Like even people who do horrendous things like molesting children, they really don't understand the impact that has, and if they're ever successfully confronted with it, they're very surprised. They can be dismissive, but if they actually see it, then they're very surprised. They didn't understand that their actions could be that harmful. And I know that might seem crazy, but it's true. Human minds can be in a huge range of possible states. Anyway, having said all this, forgiveness is when you realize that holding this anger, this hatred, this grudge is hurting you, and you start to open up to the softening, and you soften towards that person, even if, again, maybe you never talk to them again. This is just something energetically that's happening within you. Not saying this needs to be expressed outwardly, depends on the situation. But realizing, having some glimpse of the humanity of that person can be helpful. And that's, there's a saying that forgiveness follows on understanding. And this understanding can't be just intellectual. It needs to be cultivated on a deeper level. And it connects to an understanding of humanity in general, of human nature. So anyway, this is a big topic, and I don't know that I adequately treated it, but I also wanted to get to some other questions as well. But Jennifer asks specifically, she says, I've only ever forgiven someone when I was in love with them. I'm definitely not in love with my family. Is it enough to just let them live? Well, yes, maybe, acknowledging, the beauty of the fact that you haven't killed them is itself you're recognizing the seeds of forgiveness. I don't know if that's what you meant, but yes, it's enough to just let them live. And it's also important for a yogi or a yogini to learn to as as Mirabai put it, unravel the fetters of family. And what that partially means is that with practice, you don't see your parents as parents anymore. You see them as humans, not as my parents. As long as you view them as your parents, you're always a child in relation to them, right? If you're viewing your parents as my parents, you're infantilizing yourself. And so you need to, view them as human beings who are just, as messed up as any other human being, probably not much more so, although it might seem the case if you have unresolved samskaras. Anyway, again, it's a big topic. But a big part of this, for sure, and this is the last bit, is to find it in your heart to grant to all beings their freedom to be exactly as they are. So they don't need to be different. And if they are dangerous, if they are unhealthy, then you need to keep an appropriate distance, right? That's your responsibility. It's not their responsibility to change for you. And you can't expect people to do that or rely on people to do that, as one of my teachers says, you can trust everyone to be exactly who they are. So the responsibility here is yours to decide what degree of approach or distance is right or appropriate with any given relationship, yeah. Okay. So moving on, there's more questions. Somebody asks about what's the significance of a certain experience, and this is actually very important. People have a huge misunderstanding around this on the spiritual path and in yoga in general. They assume experiences have significance, but in general, they don't. Now, an experience may bring with it a mystical experience, right, or a visionary experience or a spiritual experience may be accompanied by a noetic quality, as one philosopher called it, meaning it may be accompanied by insight, a specific insight, which is often wordless at first. But this is different from after the fact interpretation, which is usually just confabulation, right? So the mind wants to interpret and assign meaning and assign significance, and that's all just, confabulation and imagination and wishful thinking. But sometimes a spiritual experience can be ritambhara, as Patanjali calls it, truth-bearing or wisdom-bearing in and of itself, meaning to say that the insight arrives unbidden as part of the experience. There's a new sort of clarity of vision about something. And, then you might have to struggle to kind of put that insight into words, but it's very different, has a very different quality from this after the fact, mental interpretation or confabulation. Now, but spiritual experiences are not really to be interpreted, or a lot of people come to teachers like me and say, well, what does this mean that I had this experience? And the unsatisfying answer is, well, it probably doesn't mean anything. It's an experience, Now, again, if it came with an organic, insight sort of built into the experience, then that's worth unpacking and exploring. But it's just like, if you're sitting outside and a butterfly comes and lands on your head, that's a beautiful experience. And there are those people who will be like, oh, what does it mean? And they're going to look up in their books the symbolism of butterfly and what sign is the universe trying to give me? This is wrong view from the point of view of Tantra, from the point of view of the spiritual path, I would say, because the universe is not something other than you that is sending you messages. This is, just it's a weird kind of form of thinking that seems to be a kind of just abstracted version of dualistic Western religion, where the universe as a phrase is being used in sentences where a generation ago they just would have said God. Now people just say the universe, and it's this dualistic separation, like the universe could be something that could send you a message. But there is no such distinction. You are the universe. There's no, you don't stand outside the universe. How can you characterize it as something separate from you? Now, having said that, of course, there's pattern. There's pattern to reality. And sometimes we do get little, clues or hints or, if you want to call them signs, but they're not signs in that sense. They're just little, the clues and hints are actually everywhere all the time to the deep structure or fundamental pattern of reality. And it's just that we're usually so caught up in our own mind stream, in our own thoughts and self-referencing, that we don't notice that the clues and hints to the nature of reality and its deep structure or pattern are abundantly scattered everywhere. So people, notice one and it's a synchronicity or it's like a magical visitation or whatever, but that's just, you're actually just seeing what's normal. It seems abnormal because most of the time you're just lost in thought. So anyway, the point is that whatever happens, it's lovely and, or terrifying. You can have spiritual experiences that are terrifying, but it's just, if you're, if we use the metaphor of you're journeying down a road, in this case, the spiritual path, it's just a metaphor, but you're going to see some things along the way, and they don't necessarily have anything to do with where you're headed, but you're inevitably going to see some things along the way. And if part of this process is, as it is for many people, expanding your sense of what's real, overthrowing the tyranny of ordinary appearances, overthrowing your cultural conditioning, and deconstructing it and seeing a broader kind of scope to reality, which is there to be seen, then obviously you're also going to start to have experiences that are out of the ordinary, but they're not really out of the ordinary. They're just outside the frame of your cultural conditioning. Okay, so in that sense, those experiences are significant in a general sense. They're like, thumbs up, like something's working. You're expanding the possibilities for the ways that you can experience reality. But it's very dangerous if you get into assigning meaning to the specific details of the experience and over-interpreting it. And because that can lead eventually in some people to what's called schizotypal thinking, which I'm not a psychologist or psychiatric professional, so I can't get into that in any authoritative detail. But it has to do with constantly sort of projecting your imagined meanings onto reality instead of seeing that reality is, on the conceptual level, quite meaningless. It's on the non-conceptual level, it's deeply meaningful, of course, but none of the stories that you could possibly tell about reality actually are it. Reality is fundamentally non-verbal and non-conceptual. Anyway, now, so somebody in the question thread asked specifically about the experience of seeing a blue orb. And yes, this is a tradition. This is something that's traditionally talked about. But I would just be wary of this kind of mental tendency of like, oh, if I had an experience that's described in the scriptures, then it's valid. And if I had an experience which isn't, then it's not. That's not true. And by the way, we've lost a lot more of the scriptural corpus of Tantra and yoga than we have preserved. So who knows what's described in those lost texts. Having said that, a blue orb or a blue bindu that's a specific color blue, cobalt blue, like the color of the peacock's neck, that's sometimes called the Nila bindu. Some teachers, such as Swami Muktananda, have attributed a lot of significance to this, as a sort of signpost on the path. One of these experiences that means, yes, you're on the right path, you're going in the right direction, but not having any more specific meaning than that. And experiences in general don't mean that there's something you should do, which is sometimes how Westerners tend to interpret them. Unless, again, that a deep and profound wordless insight arrived of its own accord that oriented you in a particular direction, and it feels right, it feels true. Yeah, okay. Somebody asks, how can you tell the difference between a true revelation and a projection of conditioned mind? This is one of those questions that's a little bit hard to answer in the case of anyone, including myself, for whom that difference has become extremely clear and stark even. And it can be easy to forget how for some people that difference is not yet clear. And it's impossible to explain this in a way that's gonna simply work every time. But revelation or intuitive insight, what the tradition calls pratibha, arrives, it arrives from a deeper level of your being than concept, than thinking, than any sort of verbal or thought construct. It arrives from a level deeper than these vikalpas, or mental constructs. And like I already said, it's wordless, at least initially. You might, kind of work it up into something you can articulate, but true insight is usually wordless. See, the problem talking about this stuff is there's always exceptions, because sometimes an insight can sort of burst into your mind, or into your awareness in words, but that's fairly rare. Usually it's just this feeling starts to arise of, something very, very simple. Again, it could be like just an orientation to take a step back from a person or situation, or take a step towards a given person or situation, or an intuition that, of a kind of significant paradigm shift that needs to happen in your life. Something like that. Anyway, it doesn't arrive, on the basis of sort of casting about mentally. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that, and the mind is sort of jumping here and there, and then hits on something that it likes and wants to call that a revelation. It doesn't happen like that. When a true intuitive insight arises, the word pratibha literally means brightening towards. It's as if when you turn, towards that which is actually beneficial for you, something in you goes, yes, there's something for me there. And usually not in words, right? So if it's complicated, it's almost definitely a projection of your conditioned mind. Intuitive insight is simple, How does a dog know? Not all dogs, but some dogs know when their owner or master, or a member of the family is coming home after being gone for weeks, and the dog will be by the door. Animals have this intuitive insight as well. It's just this feeling, oh, something's happening, someone's coming, he's coming, and it's not, of course, in words. Dogs don't think in words. So just as a way of illustrating, that this intuitive insight is something that, at least some animals exhibit, that they have as well. So that could help you orient to how simple it actually is, when it's real. It's that which you're sharing in common with some other mammals. Okay. Somebody asks about, maybe tongue-in-cheek, but they asked about what's the tantric take on current events. Well, there isn't one, and that actually is important because in the tantric view, whatever's going on, it's just another version of the same thing that's always been going on. And the thing about humans, human minds, maybe I should say, they have a flair for the dramatic. People love to think that they're living in extraordinarily significant times or extraordinarily challenging times. People love to believe that they're living in a unique time, when by definition that's never true. There's just no such thing as a unique time. And this is very much the Indian tradition, which never had a linear concept of history, never had a concept of historical evolution. And indeed, I would argue for good reasons. I don't think there is, demonstrably anything like historical evolution. Because there's progress in industry and technology, but why in the world would you imagine that is, improvement. Just look at human lives. Humans are not any, happier when you put them in easier circumstances unless they, discover the spiritual path. Humans contrive to suffer in virtually any circumstance you put them in. Now, having said that, we do have, of course, easier lives. Even in the middle of a pandemic, we have much, much easier lives than most people in history. And just to do a little reality check here, if you read up about the possibilities of infectious diseases and pandemics, we have been extraordinarily lucky. Not that there's any such thing as luck in a literal sense, but that it is possible. It's perfectly biologically possible for there to be a pandemic with a 50% mortality rate instead of a 2% mortality rate. So we've been so lucky. And then on top of that, just a little historical perspective. So many times in history that were incalculably harder to live through. The Great Leap Forward in China in the late 50s. Incalculable suffering. If you don't know about that history, read about it. It'll give you some perspective. Anyway, I could go on and on about that. But yeah, I mean, I think people in general don't know about what humans have lived through in the past. So I'll cut myself off. I was going to talk about the utter devastation of the Khwarezmian Empire by the Mongols in the 13th century, but I won't tell that story because this video will be too long. And you might say, oh, I've never heard of the Khwarezmian Empire. Exactly, because they killed every single person in it. Anyway, sorry, that's not really supposed to be something that one laughs at, I suppose. Anyway, moving on. Anna asks about the rampant misunderstandings around the concepts of divine feminine and divine masculine. So this is a huge topic, but it really does bear repeating that classical Tantra and Neo-Tantra do not share the same view of reality. They don't share the same practices. They don't share the same view. They have almost no connection to each other whatsoever, So this is I hate to burst the bubble of those who, have received lots of benefit from Neo-Tantra. And that benefit is real if it is, right? If all your alleged benefit seems to evaporate when you find out that Neo-Tantra has no basis in classical Tantra, then it wasn't really there in the first place. It was just a conceptual thing you were hanging on to. But if you received real benefit from any practices in any domain or any tradition, then finding out the story you've been told about that tradition is untrue doesn't rob you of those benefits, right? Because they're not contingent upon the story. They're contingent upon whether the practices actually did something, actually opened you up in some significant way. But yeah, Neo-Tantra, which is what's taught in, workshops all over the world that are called tantric sex workshops. Neo-Tantra is not based in classical Tantra. It's its own thing. It's just that 100 years ago, they poached the word. It's an example of what we now call cultural appropriation. The word Tantra was poached, and there's no actual direct connection at all. Now, so it's of course become more complex because now a lot of people involved in Neo-Tantra are studying classical Tantra as well and sort of mixing the two together. And so the waters are, it's no longer quite so clearly separated. And this is not me putting down Neo-Tantra at all. It's just a different thing. Now, having said that, we have all this discourse in Neo-Tantra that gets shuttled into classical Tantra when people sort of make the leap. And a lot of people are making the leap these days. A lot of people, felt, something significant happen in their introduction to Neo-Tantra, and then they find out about classical tantric teachings and they feel, oh, this feels, sort of deeper or more substantial or more rooted or something. And they make the leap in baby steps or in one big step. But the unfortunate kind of thing that happens is that assumptions from a different worldview, the Neo-Tantric one, get shuttled in to their classical Tantra practice. And one of these assumptions is that there's something called the divine feminine and the divine masculine. These are not terms or phrases that we find in classical Tantra. There's no such thing as masculine energy or feminine energy. Okay, this is a Western cultural construct. And so this is a big part of the problem, is that people don't have a clear sense of what's actually, coming from the tradition they want to study and what's sort of overlaid on top of it recently. The test here is that when you get specific with these things, the idea rapidly falls apart. And I test this all the time. I say to people, what do you mean by masculine energy or feminine? What does that actually mean? And they don't have a clear answer because it's a concept with no referent and objective reality. So now, when people talk about divine feminine and divine masculine, they do mean something specific, which is they're imagining the sort of healthiest expression of the gender stereotypes that they identify as masculine and feminine. But those gender stereotypes are completely cultural constructs, right? They're not based in reality per se. Now, this is, okay still to some extent, because people are at least striving towards, what's a healthier expression of my femininity or my masculinity or whatever. But you just don't even need those concepts. I would just invite you to just throw the gender stereotypes away, because you don't need that to ask this question of what would be the healthiest expression of my emotional and sexual self. Why don't you just say that, right? Because there's no there. If you're talking about the feminine or the masculine, what do you mean? All you mean is whatever traits you have decided on the basis of your cultural conditioning are masculine or feminine. And just because you acquire some new cultural conditioning from, New Age religion or wherever it comes from, that doesn't mean it's not cultural conditioning. Just because you have newer cultural conditioning that contradicts older cultural conditioning, it's still cultural conditioning. Okay, so any kind of concepts about masculine or feminine, that's just a mental construct, right? So my point is, we can accomplish the same desirable goals more efficiently. Instead of like, how can I access and express the divine feminine or the divine masculine, why don't you just ask, how can I express my whole being, my emotional self, my sexual self, et cetera, in the healthiest possible way for the benefit of all beings? That's a worthwhile question. And it's, of course, it's something that's going to take a lot of cultivation, and you run into this pitfall of self-hatred whenever your behavior is less than ideal, which can sort of scuttle the whole project. But anyway, this is the short version of the rant. So, it's something I've said over and over in the group, but still hasn't quite landed for people, is, the deities in the Indian tradition that are male and female, they're male and female on an entirely arbitrary linguistic basis, meaning to say if the word, because Sanskrit is a gendered language, like German or French or Spanish, many other languages. But English is not gendered. So if you didn't grow up fluent in another language, you don't really get this. Words, nouns in these languages have arbitrary genders. Like a table. Is the word table in Spanish? Is it la mesa? Anyway, it's a feminine thing, but it's not actually. Nobody thinks that tables are inherently somehow feminine, as in related to women more than men. Nobody thinks that. It's just that the noun table happens to be a feminine noun. It's arbitrary. In the same way, then, Sanskrit, almost all the nouns have an arbitrary gender. And whenever any of those nouns gets personified as a metaphor, you guys, there's the anthropomorphization of an aspect of reality is always metaphorical. Okay, so the deity that represents or embodies or expresses that principle is going to be the gender of whatever the word is, the word that the deity embodies, like whatever it might be. Pratibha, intuition, a feminine noun. It's going to be represented as a goddess, and is, and so on and so forth. So it's not because they thought these or those qualities are somehow inherently more related to men or more related to women at all. Okay, so Shakti is a feminine word. It means power or energy. It's personified as the goddess, the great goddess. Mahadevi, the pride of place is given to this personification of energy or power, Shakti, right? And, Shiva, the word Shiva literally means blessing, but Shiva is understood to be, consciousness, pure consciousness. And therefore, in this paradigm is seen as a sort of passive principle in contradistinction to the active principle of Shakti. But this is not some description of human male-female relations or how they should be or anything like that. And the point I was trying to make in one of the posts is that those supposed gender roles, which actually aren't gender roles, are switched in the Buddhist context just because the word upaya, skillful means or effective method, happens to be a masculine word. So that's represented as a kind of a male divinity. And the word prajna, wisdom, is represented as a female divinity. And there the male principle is active and the female principle is passive. And it's the reverse in Shaivism. But this has nothing to do with femininity or masculinity. It is to do with complementarity, however, right? So there's a metaphor at work here whereby certain things go together, and when they go together, they have creative power. So just like a man and a woman come together and can create a child, when upaya and prajna, skillful means, and wisdom or insight come together, that's a powerful complementary creative combination. Just like when Shiva and Shakti, consciousness and energy, come together, that's a creative, powerful combination, right? But that's just the metaphor here is about complementarity. It's not about masculinity or femininity at all. Okay, so maybe I talked about that too long. I don't know, but and this is all, this is all extemporaneous. You guys, I'm not preparing for these videos, so forgive me if I talk too long or too short or whatever it is. Okay. So here in the live chat, we've got some comments. So, Mark says jokingly, I love my manhood. It's one of my favorite social mental constructs. And he's tongue in cheek, but there's an important thing here, which is that you get to love whatever qualities about yourself that you love. Like if you experience yourself as being strong, as being firm, as being steady and stable, as being, equanimous, you don't actually have to associate those qualities with masculinity, which again is just a made up idea, to value and honor those qualities, And if you're somebody who loves being soft and flowy and willowy and effective space holder, whatever it is, value those qualities, but you don't need to reinforce the stereotypes that link them artificially to femininity, right? And then people come along and say, well, wait a second, we actually do see, if we kind of survey the population, that men are more likely to be the sort of strong silent types and women are more likely to be communicative or flowing or whatever it is. But you see, that's precisely because people have internalized these gender stereotypes, and everybody is, at least subconsciously, concerned about how they're supposed to act to maintain others' approval. So the fact that people are living out the stereotypes does not prove the stereotypes correct, right? This is a very, very significant logical fallacy, confusing the cause for the effect and the effect for the cause. Okay, anyway, so I guess that's the end of that topic. Okay, in the live chat window, Christopher, who I met years ago in Sweden, asks this question about meditation. I don't know what this question is yet. I'm encountering it in real time with you guys. He says, I often have experience of two quite different experiences of meditation, and I don't know which one I should seek to try to cultivate, i.e. which is real or correct meditation. I'm not sure about that way of framing the question, but let's see. One experience is like an experience of awareness, but without a me present. I feel like I'm in the still center of a hurricane and thoughts blow by on the outside, occurring and dissolving on their own. This is clearly a meditative absorption. The hard thing is not to lose consciousness here. Okay, and then he describes a second experience, number 2. The other state is not different from my ordinary waking state. There is no meditative absorption. I'm fully awake and aware with a me, but with no or very few thoughts, just clarity and awakeness. Which of these two experiences should I try to cultivate in the context of this tradition? Yeah, the whole framing of it is a little problematic. Which experience should you try to cultivate? Rather, I would say that whatever experience arrives, there's some possible nuancing within that. It's not an either or, that you should choose one or the other. And indeed, you probably can't choose one or the other. You probably can't on demand decide whether there's going to be a feeling of I or me present. So I'll just briefly take these one at a time. And again, in the first sort of experience, he talks about, there's awareness, but there's no me. And thoughts are occurring, but he has in this experience no sense that he is the thinker of the thoughts, which is great. This is a very crucial thing to happen in meditative practice. It's absolutely required to sooner or later see through the illusion that you are the thinker of the thoughts or the creator of the thoughts, and to learn how to become sort of disidentified with thoughts, which doesn't mean dissociating from them. It means you're not identified. You don't think of yourself as the one who's thinking the thoughts anymore, which people just do habitually and compulsively. But Christopher says the hard thing is not to lose consciousness here, meaning when he's experiencing this awareness with no me, with everything just arising spontaneously, that he easily slips into a kind of, not fully conscious state. So there is something to do, because you do want to very gently remain fully present and aware and awake. But you have to be very, very gentle with this, because if you try to do anything, there comes the me again, comes right back in, because this artificial sense that you're the doer of the actions, which you're actually not, but it tends to come in. So what I'm talking about is this very subtle fine tuning. You're just since you're cultivating meta awareness, metacognition, moment to moment, you notice, awareness is getting duller, or whatever you want to call it. Consciousness is getting duller, mind is getting duller, doesn't matter. And then there's this very subtle fine tuning, as if somebody just very gently rang a bell, right? And that's a good metaphor, because if somebody very gently rang a bell, that doesn't invoke your artificial sense of me or doer, So just be, you just do that without doing it. You see what I mean? You just gently, sort of ding yourself into slightly more awake awareness, right? Staying awake and present. Because if you go into trance-like state, then there's no real spiritual benefit. It's restful, it's nice, but there's no spiritual benefit to trance states. And a lot of people who think they're meditating are just getting into trances, and that's why you don't see radical transformation or ever greater awakeness in those folks. Okay, and then as number 2, he's talking about fully awake and aware, but with a me, and no or very few thoughts. See, that's totally fine. The me is just there, or it's not there. It's a feeling of being a subject. There's objects that you're aware of, and there's a subject aware of the objects. That is not actually true, but it is something that the mind generates very, very easily and habitually. Subject-object distinction, So you can very gently let go of this me, maybe, by just noticing that there's no seer separate from the seeing. There's just seeing. Right? There's no hearer separate from the hearing. Right? You can't, if you look, you don't find one. You don't find a separate self. So there's this is what's really bizarre about it. There's a feeling of being a subject, but it's just a feeling. It's actually another thing arising in consciousness. Just like a sound can arise, right? Or a thought, there's a feeling of, there's a me, but it's just something arising in consciousness. It's not any more significant than a gust of wind or a bird chirp or anything else. But you just gently just look and see, oh, and if you can't see that, if it does seem to you that there is a hearer separate from hearing, then it's the thought of me as doer, thinker, actor, or hearer is strong in that moment, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can just be there. It can just be an appearance within consciousness. Jean asks in the live chat, what is the navarna mantra tantric? What is its significance? Yes, it's tantric. It's Sri Vidya. What is its significance is the wrong question. Sorry to be blunt. One asks of mantras, what can it do? What does it do? What is that mantra, aimed at? What is its effect? Because again, mantras don't have significance. They don't have conceptual significance. And if any teachers in this tradition teach otherwise, it's purely a concession to the Western mentality, yeah. John asks about the position of the chakra above the hard palate. And he was observing through, looking at anatomical cross sections of the head, that the space right above the hard palate is forward of the usual location for the central channel, which runs right through the midline of the body from this point on the crown of the head down to the pelvic floor. So yes, in general, chakras are arranged along the central channel. But an important thing to consider here is the width of the central channel, because in most people, before yogic practice, the central channel is said to be as slender as a lotus fiber. I mean, that's like half a millimeter. That's like half a millimeter thick, incredibly slender. But through yogic practice, you can experience the central channel as being, what is that? 5 centimeters thick. You can even experience it expanding until the entire body is one channel. All the other channels get swallowed up, and the central channel becomes there's only the central channel. You only have one channel, and it's as thick as your body. You can have that experience. That's more rare, but a lot of people can experience, a fairly substantial, almost golden pillar-like central channel. And if that's the case, then that palate chakra has now been subsumed within the central channel. But yes, of course, there are chakras that are not, exactly on that midline. We also even, we have chakras in our legs and all over the place that are subsidiary. They're considered subsidiary, all the primary ones being along the central channel. Okay. I'll finish with, and by the way, it's nice to maybe mention briefly that in very, very ancient Vedic times, the Suṣumnā nadi, the graceful channel, was an imagined astronomical thing, which was a channel between the sun, the literal physical sun and moon, through which people imagine, like this is like 3,000 years ago, people imagined that like energy would flow to the moon along this channel and fill up the moon. That's what made the moon get fuller, is like, you know, some small amount of energy would be flowing from the sun to the moon along this Suṣumnā. And then it would, you know, retract and the energy would flow back again. And that's what made the moon get smaller, you know, and become the new moon. And so then later this, you know, there's this idea that an auspicious death is when you exit out the crown of your head and you travel via the Suṣumnā in the sky to the heavenly realms or the realms of the gods or whatever. And this is also a very early idea. And so then this kind of terminology of this graceful channel, literally Suṣumnā, graceful, gets, you know, used to describe the central channel in human beings. And of course, there's interesting symbology of sun and moon. But now in the yogic body, the sun and moon are associated with the two lateral channels. Right, lunar channel on the left, solar channel on the right, which, by the way, are not called masculine and feminine. So this is fascinating, by the way. Sorry to jump back to that topic just for a moment, because when I taught in the foundations course about the lunar left channel and the reddish right channel, solar channel, some people even assumed that they were feminine and masculine respectively, even though I never used those words. So this is interesting. Yeah, we do see in Ardhanarishwara, the half Shiva, half Shakti image, right? It's true that Shakti is always the left half of the body and Shiva is always the right half of the body. But that's the only kind of place where we can find any, you know, genderizing of sides of the body. And when we're talking about the channels, it's always lunar and solar. It's never feminine and masculine. Okay. So last questions. How long is this? Oh my gosh, overtime. Last question. Somebody in the live chat says, let's say a master from your tradition meets some master from Dzogchen universe. Do they speak about the same when using the term Tantra? No, for complicated reasons, okay? Because in Tibetan Buddhism, you know, the term Tantra is often used for, you know, to refer to the teachings and practices and rituals of the sort of bulk of the tradition that the Dzogchen teachings then kind of went beyond or surmounted, you know. So Dzogchen practitioners will sometimes contrast their teaching to that of Tantra as separate things, even though it's all part of the tantric universe, right? And the same distinction actually used to exist in Shaivism as well, because a tantrika in the old days, a tantrika, that term would often be used for, you know, the ritualists, you know, the dualist tantrikas and the ritualist ones were called tantrika, and then the non-dualists would call themselves kaulas and differentiate the kaula, you know, way from the tantric way. But again, this is outdated terminology now, and scholars just refer to all of this as tantra because it's all part of one tradition, and these are kind of distinctions that were made to highlight that, you know, that Dzogchen or that Taoism or, you know, are quicker, more direct paths than the traditional tantric way, which involves a lot of ritual and many years of, you know, kind of arduous practice. Okay, so lastly, somebody asked, who was it? Felipe, if I'm saying your name right. How should one begin a relationship with his or her Iṣṭa-devatā, or chosen deity, without knowing its mantra? or having a guru for guidance? You cannot. Let's be clear about Iṣṭa-devatā, first of all. Chosen deity doesn't mean the deity you choose. It means the deity who chooses you. So Iṣṭa-devatā doesn't mean you kind of survey all the deities like a giant buffet and pick the one you like the most. Now, of course, people don't say like, they say resonant with. Oh, I feel resonance with this deity. And sometimes it is really something deeper than just liking or preference or kind of attraction. But often it is that, you know. But the thing is, you don't get to pick and choose, you know. The deity chooses you. How do you know? Well, because they start showing up in your life, and that will include sooner or later gaining access to the mantra of that deity and gaining access to a teacher who can properly supervise your relationship with that deity, which is extremely important, especially for the fiercer, more powerful deities who represent a faster, more direct path, but also a more, you know, fraught with peril sort of path. So you must, you know, have a teacher supervise that relationship traditionally. And such a teacher will appear if this is indeed your chosen deity. Okay, so you know, if you don't know the mantra, if you haven't received the mantra, you can't just pick it out of a book. That doesn't work. If you haven't received the mantra and there's no teacher who can guide you, then that deity has not chosen you yet. But you could pray to them. I mean, that sounds very dualistic, but it's just it's a heuristic, actually, rather than dualistic. Heuristic means something that works, even though we don't know why or how does that make sense at all. But you can pray to the deity and say, you know, I want a relationship with you. And, you know, see if they get in touch. Anyway, so yeah, Felipe mentions he feels attracted to Parā Devi, but resources on her are scarce. Which leads me to the last thing I really wanted to say in this talk, because I'm noticing that you guys and everyone basically tries to research things on the internet. And people will say, oh, I tried to do some research about this. I didn't find much. And they usually mean they're searching on the internet. This is not a good idea for anything related to Tantra unless you know exactly where to look. There's just a couple, 2-3 websites that are reliable in terms of, you know, providing information about these traditions that's not distorted and diluted. And, you know, so this is not, it's just not the sort of thing that you do your own research on. You know, you need to get connected with teachers and sources that are reliable. And I understand that those are not as numerous as we might wish, but there's still quite a few of them. In general, you guys, don't go researching stuff on the internet. This is not how it works. You can't be like, okay, I like this deity. What's their mantra? I'm going to Google this deity. I'm going to find out what their mantra is. And you might indeed find out what their mantra is, but then you're reading it off a website that is not mantra transmission. You need to hear it from somebody for whom it is alive. You need to receive it as a vibration and as a transmission. And you can't do that reading it off a website. It's not possible. Now, it could be that you watch a YouTube video of, you know, and usually in YouTube videos, teachers don't give mantra transmission at all. But if it did happen, yes, you can receive it from a video, because it's about the vibration, you see, which is not on the words on a web page. You need to hear it. So it could come through a video, and I'm not saying it has to be live or in person or anything. And then finally, Felipe says, what are the boundaries of surrendering to the guru? Yeah, so this is an interesting question, because, you know, in the very question itself, we see, you know, this profound misunderstanding that's proving fairly difficult to to correct. You know, a guru is not a person. Okay, guru is short for guru tattva. The guru tattva means the capacity within consciousness to initiate and continue a process of revealing itself to itself. Okay, so guru tattva can manifest as human teachers, but the human teacher is just, in a sense, a tool of the guru tattva, of this principle within consciousness, this capacity within consciousness to reveal itself to itself. And see, a teacher is only an expression of that guru principle if that teacher's teaching is very effective for you, and it might not be for somebody else. See, there's no static objective thing here. You can't say, oh, you know, that teacher's, if we're speaking really accurately, you can't say that teacher's a guru and that one's not, because anybody could be a kind of vehicle for the guru principle, and perhaps for a limited time, perhaps for a less limited time. But the point is, what are you surrendering to? When you surrender, you're not surrendering to a personality. You're not surrendering, you know, to somebody else's humanity. That wouldn't make any sense, right? And of course, that is what's sometimes happening in India as well as the West, when people, because people have the wrong idea in India all the time, and they surrender to the personality of the guru, and they try to be like him or act like him, and you get a cult of personality. It's an incredibly dangerous thing. But what we're really talking about when we talk about surrender, you know, and specifically surrender to the guru, is you're surrendering to the path, to the tradition that you've chosen, to perhaps to a specific lineage, and to the teachings, right? And you don't want to mix up the messenger with the message, you know? So, you know, the personality and modes of expression of a given teacher, even if they're very awake or liberated, are not really indicative of anything. And yet, when people's understanding is not mature, that's not clear. So anyway, look, here's a very dumb example, but it works. Wrong understanding would be, your teacher tells you, go jump off a bridge, and you're like, I have to do whatever my guru says, and you go jump off a bridge, okay? But if you're surrendered to the teaching, not the teacher, then if your guru says, go jump off a bridge, then you're gonna contemplate, that was a surprising thing for him or her to say. And then you kind of examine it and put it in context, and what was I saying, or what behavior was I exhibiting right before that, you know? And you realize that teachings are usually metaphorical, or they work on the basis of, you know, analogies, similes, metaphors. And you know, the teacher is not somebody who tells you what to do, even if they're telling you what to do. Maybe the teaching is to learn to think for yourself. And so the teacher will give a challenging teaching where they appear to be telling you what to do, so that you can, you know, hopefully realize that that's not the way. Anyway, so this was longer video. It's okay. Okay, so Alice just asks a long question, but we're really out of time now. So maybe we need to save that one for next time. Yeah, so Alice is offering in the chat window here a little kind of pushback against my teaching, and I would like to push back against her pushback, and say, you know, that we like this mental construct in which we are co-creators with God or the universe or whatever you want to call it. But exactly my point is there are not two things here. There's not you and the universe. There's not you and God. There's only one thing. You're a co-creator with all the other human beings around you. You're a co-creator, you know, with the context in which you find yourself embedded, absolutely. But there's no distinction possible that would allow us to say that you're a co-creator with the universe as if you somehow stand apart from it. And this is a very important thing, because when we talk about, for example, surrender to reality, people imagine themselves in this false dualism as separate from, I've got to surrender to the universe out there. I've got to surrender to everything that's not me. And it often doesn't occur to them that surrender truly has to include surrender to whatever wants to come through you as well. You know, that there is no separation. You're not standing outside. The fact that you picture yourself as standing slightly to the side of the universe is exactly the whole problem. You know, it's this sense of separate self, which is a total construct, and you reinforce the sense of separate self with this imagination of I'm getting a message from the universe. You know, that reinforces this separation, which is not even real. Yes, there are miraculous synchronicities, of course, you know, or seemingly miraculous. I mean, it is something that happens, you know, every day, miraculous. I don't know. But it does happen every day. It's just that you probably don't notice because you're most of the time lost in thoughts, lost in self-referencing, you know. Yeah, anyway, there's more there, but we'll have to come back to that next time. I'll just read a few verses from this translation of the Bhairava-stava, the hymn to Bhairava. Somebody sent me this translation. I'm not actually sure who it's by. I got to find out. But yeah, hymn to the intense, awe-inspiring power of consciousness, which is called Bhairava. It says, "O Bhairava, glory to thee, for you are the essential and supreme reality of all things. You are the shining of true knowledge, which has been revealed to the world, and I have received perfect peace in you, my true self, being fulfilled by the pure nectar of all things." You see, it's metaphorical language. The hymn is asserting, "O Lord, you are my very self." And yet it's playing with the language of you and me, because that has meaning in the context of the fact that you habitually experience yourself as this contracted locus of consciousness, which is itself just a habit, right? But insofar as you're experiencing yourself as being, you know, little old me, it makes sense to address your expanded self, you know, what Somananda called my wider self, as God, right? But in the moments when you are that, when you're not a contracted self, when you're not a separate self, then it doesn't make sense anymore. there is no sense of you and me. But insofar as you experience yourself to be this socially constructed personality mind, then it does make sense to address God, even though that God is your own wider self that you can at any moment kind of expand into and realize I am actually the whole field of consciousness and all its contents, and this body and mind are a small part of this field of awareness, and I am all of that. How could I not be? How could I be anything other than the whole of my experience? Right? So it's not really a conceptual thing. It's just a experiential seeing. What I habitually call me is just a small part of this totality that I am. Yeah. Om. So I'll end with one more verse from the Bhairava-stava. O Lord Bhairava, my being sings, dances, and rejoices deeply when it sees you, the most beloved, and achieves the sacrifice of oneness, which is otherwise so hard to accomplish. Om. I invite you to do this practice. Go for a walk or do whatever you do, and just practice seeing everything is what you are appearing in another form. And one great saint did the practice of saying with everything, thank you, Lord, for appearing in this form. Thank you, Lord, for appearing in this form. But maybe even better if you can just cultivate that perception. And if it's a thought, it's not really going to do anything, but cultivate the feeling, the perception. Whatever I perceive is what I am appearing in that form. And then you realize that you are awesome and trivial, that you are amazing and horrible. You are everything. You are all the things. You are all the possible things. Om.